People who work in morgues or with the dead, what is the creepiest thing you've witnessed? I have a good one. My mother works in a research department that uses cadavers. One day, she and a resident were practicing surgery. I believe it was a knee replacement. The cadaver was covered from the knee up. Suddenly, a very loud alarm in this lab room goes off. It startled my mom and this resident because it's a lab, there are no alarms that should be going off unless it's an absolute emergency. Not being able to find the source of the alarm, the resident degowns and makes sure it's not her pager going off. I have no idea where the alarm came from. The alarm had stopped at this point, and they decided to continue since they were only halfway through the procedure. This happens twice more until, on the third time, the resident yanks back the gown on the cadaver and points out the small scar on the chest. Apparently, this dude had a pacemaker that never got turned off post-mortem. Once they get to the last few years of life, they are usually replaced before then. They have an alarm to let people know that the battery or device needs replacement. Normally they are turned off or removed after death, but this somehow was missed. For reference, my mom has worked this job for 35 years at this point and has never had this occur. She was freaked out at the time. I was not a morgue worker but worked in a morgue. I was working for a construction company that was doing work in a large hospital. They gave us a staging room to store materials and tools, which was in the decommissioned morgue in the basement. The specific room they gave us was the old autopsy room. The morgue had multiple creepy AF parts. By the entrance, they had large barrels that the hospital used to store and amputate or remove body parts before they got picked up and incinerated. The autopsy room hadn't really been well cleaned when the morgue was shut down, and it even had the organ weights from the last autopsy still on the chalkboard on the wall. One of the old freezer rooms had a broken freezer that wasn't shut down properly and would sporadically make a banging noise. There was a special refrigerated room that had a sign on the door saying baby house, which basically was the baby-sized morgue freezers. With that mental image in mind, here goes. One night, at about 11 p.m., I had to bring some tools down. The old autopsy room was at the end of the hall, and considering I had been going down there for about a month, the morgue didn't really bother me anymore, so I didn't turn on the hallway lights. I get to the room, which is pitch black, open the padlock, and step inside. I'm reaching for the light switch when something starts moving around and banging into stuff in the corner of the room. I flipped the complete literal fuck out. After what felt like an hour of scrabbling in the dark, I got the light on and found out that a cat had climbed in through a window someone had left open, and when I walked in, I had woken it up. The closest I've ever gotten to shitting myself in fear. When I was in college, I worked for the Willed Body program. I wanted to be a doctor. Well, one day I walked into the morgue and discovered that the delivery crew had left a recently deceased person in the open space. I have seen some gnarly stuff, but this scene regularly plays out in my head. It is nothing grotesque, just an old lady in her nightgown, desperately clutching a teddy bear. She looked as though she saw a ghost, her expression was as though she was gasping in terror. That scene made me jump because I wasn't expecting it. However, seeing this person in their last moments left a huge impression on me. It just makes me wonder how terrifying it must be to face death. And that thought further resonates with me when I think of people committing suicide. How horrible must one feel to knowingly and willfully run into the dark embrace of death? If anything, as I grow older, that scene reminds me to be better, forgive, and express love and happiness. I worked for a company that processed bodies that were donated to science. These were people who really couldn't afford their own funeral and were in homes that were not of a great reputation. A woman's body comes in and weighs almost nothing. The number 63 pounds is stuck in my head, but that seems incredibly low, and I'm questioning my memory. I can lift her with little effort to a shelf above my head. She died from cancer, so I expected to be somewhat appalled. When we dissect her, we find her hip had dislocated as she refused to get a pelvis. She was covered in bed sores, many clients were, and was in really bad condition. It really bothered me to see the state of this woman. I was still in training, and I asked my boss, isn't this a situation where we should contact a governing body about the conditions this person was obviously living in for a while? I was surprised when I was told I wasn't getting the training and that they were going to go with someone else. 6 weeks into their 12-week training program. I was working on a case near Crystal Springs during a night in August back in '92. The call came in about someone who had been found under a tarp on the side of the road. I guess the body had been sitting for a while because the report said the body showed signs of major decomposition. My partner and I get there. It's almost pitch black outside except for the light from the night sky. In some parts of Nevada, you'd think you were in space because of how clear the sky can be. This was one of those nights. Anyway, we find the spot that was reported and immediately see the tarp, except it's not a tarp as much as it is a parachute. This was a back road just off 375 heading west, and anyone with any knowledge of the area along that road knows how barren and desolate it can seem, especially at night. It can feel like some sort of scene from an old western or something, but as soon as we stepped out of our UCV, it's like all of that washed over us because it was incredibly quiet and very eerie. It's like it was too quiet, but there was a beauty to it, too. It was just weird. I walk up to the body, which is underneath the parachute. Given the proximity to the base, I was somewhat excited because I assumed it had to be something related to one of the experimental flights or something you'd expect from X-Files or something. And I think it was. I removed the parachute to discover what I'll never forget, a body that didn't look human. I mean, it was human, or at least, at some point, it was. It was completely calcified, but it looked like it was almost glass. I have no idea to this day what happened to this person, but the body itself was without a single piece of clothing, with very little surface along the body, reminiscent of what would have been biological in nature. I would have thought it to be a mannequin, except you could see what was left of a rib cage, a spine, a femur, and what looked like burnt plastic on the body in various spots, which was actually whatever was left of the sublayers of skin and fat, all rock hard. It looked completely solidified and had no malleability whatsoever, like stone or glass. I wasn't sure how to report it or what to even say to my partner, who was grabbing some things from the truck, but once she came over to see what I saw, she was speechless. What's even more weird was how hot it felt, as if it had been sitting under a direct heat lamp. But the weeds around the body made it seem as if the body had been there for months because the weeds were overgrown. We tried to determine how best to proceed and called it a flight accident. As soon as we did, our chief along with some other investigators came out, which was strange for our team and situation because we rarely saw them come out for things like this. Understand that it was about 2 a.m, so paging all these other people from our station was in and of itself an abnormal situation, but once a local field office agent came out, we knew it had something to do with Groom. It wasn't 20 minutes after they showed up that we were thanked for our services but asked to vacate the area once their guys came out with what looked like a few Hummers along with a few weird-looking utility vehicles. To this day, I have no idea what I was looking at. It was one of the strangest things I've ever seen, and I think the heat we felt was radiation because I lost some hair later that month in a few clumps one morning when taking a shower. I don't work in a morgue, but one of my employees was in a home hospice, and his wife called me to check why his oxygen sensor wasn't working well. Long story, but I was a friend of family. As you'd expect, it wasn't malfunctioning. He was just at the death door and had likely taken his last breaths before I walked in the door because the numbers were in the 80s and his eyes looked glazed, but he was still warm. His fingers felt cold, and I felt no heartbeat, so I had to be the one to break the news. Then his wife started screaming and crying, so I gave her space until she asked me to help dress him for the show. She wanted to bring co-workers to view, she's Thai, so I guess this is custom? And so I helped her put him in his best suit. While turning and resituating his body, he made growing and raspy sounds. Then a couple people came to view, followed by her calling the crematory folks to carry him out like 2 hours later. It was a surreal experience that I still haven't quite unpacked 2 years later. I'm a paramedic, a couple calls come to mind. We pronounced her a lady and were packing up when her eyes opened. Muscle spasm and movement aren't uncommon with recently dead bodies, but this one made me double-check for a pulse out of my own peace of mind. I've seen 2 cases of CPR-induced consciousness, where the person becomes awake and grabs at you while you do CPR, but when you stop, they become dead and flaccid again. This happens when the heart is not beating, or in a shockable rhythm like V-talk, but the arrest is so fresh that by doing CPR, you supply enough blood to the brain to induce some level of consciousness. One of my colleagues just had one such case and was forced to sedate the dead person with ketamine so they could continue beating his heart for him until they got to the hospital. I did a wellness check for a man who was not well. After several days, we found him sitting on the floor, slumped upright against the wall. His mouth hung open while being filled with vomit and fluid. While chatting with the rookie police officer, I heard a very quiet, bubbling noise like a fish tank. I came to realize it was the gases escaping from his bloated corpse, bubbling up through the vomit in his mouth. Honorable mention, that time I was called to a graveyard at 10 p.m. on Halloween night for a medical alarm, i.e., lifeline. We thought we were somehow being pranked, but it turns out the small records office on site had a security alarm that was miscoded as a medical alarm. Tissue donors. I work at a funeral home, and the most disturbing thing I see are long bone tissue donors. This is when the tissue harvesters completely remove all the bones in the lower, and sometimes upper, limbs. They often replace the bones with PVC pipes. I once noticed they used thick wooden dowels, like chair legs. When you go to move the legs, they just feel so floppy. Hollow too. There is no structure to them anymore, so they just ragdoll in your grip. The worst part is the feet. The feet are usually still intact, which weighs the legs down. There is nothing connecting them, so they just become these knockers that can flop around 360 degrees at the ankle. Embalming tissue donors is a whole other beast. That takes lots of time and skill. Final note, tissue donations are life-saving, despite the strangeness that comes with them. It is the kindest gift the deceased can offer to the living. It gives many people a second chance at life. Although tissue donations can pose a challenge at the funeral home, I always admire the immense generosity of the person who decided to share their body to help others. 10 years ago this month, my mom died suddenly. When the paramedics were performing CPR on her upstairs, I went outside to get some air as I was having what I know now was a panic attack. One of the police officers that was there came to try and get me back inside the house and told me they had found a faint heat beat. I was immediately filled with hope that she would be okay, but what I, presumably, nor did the cop, realize was that the paramedics had given her an adrenaline shot, but it wasn't enough. The worst night of my life. I was 16. I held her hand that night for a long time and just couldn't stop noticing how cold her usually warm hands were. I miss her terribly. After that, I thought about going to mortuary school after I graduated high school. The people at the funeral home we chose were so kind and helpful. I am now almost a teacher, but I sometimes regret not going into it to help others through such a hard time. I guess I could still do so one day. I worked in law enforcement, not directly with the dead full time. I received a case at 5 a.m. in the morning, reports of a break-in at a mausoleum in a graveyard. Responding deputies had not gone in because it was dark and spooky out by the time we arrived, and also because there was clearly no imminent threat to anyone. Someone had broken in through the lock and glass doors of the mausoleum and gone inside. When we investigated further, we found in the depths of the place that a family coffin had been broken out of its marble slot 15 feet above the floor and dragged down. Everything inside had been taken, allegedly only including 3 cremated people's remains. The last time it had been opened was nearly 15 years prior, in 2001. Cameras on the only access points to the graveyard showed nothing all night, and when we contacted the out-of-state only surviving family, I had a nice conversation until I mentioned what it was regarding. At that point, they said, in English, "I don't speak English," and hung up. I was never able to get in contact with them again. To this day, I have no idea about the whys, hows, or who's involved with this case. I'm assuming it involves drugs, but I probably will never know. I was EVS staff at a hospital for 6.5 years, and I would service the hospital morgue every so often if I was put on the schedule that takes care of that area. Many times I've been in the morgue cleaning while they're taking care of a deceased patient. The first time I was in there, it was this elderly man they were taking care of. He just sat up. That is the closest I've ever been to shitting myself. Like I screamed. The person training me and the 2 ladies taking care of the deceased elderly man looked at me and chuckled and were like, "First time, huh?" I asked why that happened. They said a pocket of air must have been trapped in the abdominal area. This happens once in a while, and when they roll the deceased patient to their side, sometimes they'll also grunt or groan, but they assured me it was completely normal. Needless to say, if a deceased patient was being taken care of, I would ask how long until they were done. They'd tell me, and I'd come back later. Low-key, the morgue was one of my favorite places to take care of in the summer since it was at a crisp 62 degrees Fahrenheit, similarly to our rooms. For a period of time, I dated a girl who was an apprenticing funeral director and embalmer. Part of her scope also included preparing funeral documents, including graphics, photo rolls, guest books, etc. We had plans to hang out one night, but she was working late and particularly stressed about a service she was preparing, so I surprised her at the funeral home with a pizza. She was the only one working in the building that night. We went into the upstairs office to enjoy our za, and then I was going to leave to let her get back to it. As we were eating, she mentioned the person she was preparing was very adamant they did not want a service or memorial, but the family was pushing for one anyway. She was having a lot of troubles getting the documents together, for example, things not saving or printing correctly, files corrupted, etc., which was unusual since she's done this work a lot before, and she was pretty stressed about it. When I came downstairs to leave, all the lights in the funeral home were on, which was pretty weird. Did we turn them on and forget? Did someone come into the building? WTF? Since she was alone, we figured we'd do a walkthrough of the building just to make sure no one entered. The front door was unlocked and it was after hours. It was locked when I showed up, but she couldn't remember if she locked it when I came in. She was too excited by pizza. We both had this uneasy feeling, and room by room, we swept the building to make sure no one was there and turned off the lights. Literally every single light was on, even closets and shit, and that was very weird. The last area was in the back and included the crematorium, the embalming/prep room, a storage area for materials, and a loading dock. You didn't have a clear line of sight from the doorway. In front of you was the material storage, with the loading dock around the corner out of sight from the door, the embalming rooms to the left, and the crematorium adjacent to that. The body of the person who did not want this service was in the prep room. I cleared the storage area and then walked with her to the embalming rooms and stood by the door while GF went into the embalming room to check it. No joke. The second she turned off the lights in the room where the body was kept, a radio at full volume turned on in the loading dock. I was so uneasy, and the sound was so unexpected that I almost spit on my pants. I ran to kill the radio and clear the loading dock, and no one was there. We turned off the rest of the lights, and I got the fuck out of there while she stayed behind to finish her work for another hour or two. That night, my GF firmly believed the spirit of the person who did not want this service performed was there, as were the source of the lights, the radio, and her troubles with building the document package. I don't really believe in spiritual things, ghosts, or anything like that, but I have no other way to explain what happened that night. It was fucking weird, and it still creeps me out when I think about it. I worked for a big funeral care provider in the UK, and everyone in the mortuary I visited as part of my time with them in Scotland had some kind of paranormal experience. The creepiest and most famous one among the staff, the manager of the place told me, was that an elderly gentleman had died and been brought in to do an embalming so he could be viewed by his family and prepared for the funeral. He was kept there up until his funeral, so roughly 2 weeks to a month while everything was put into place for him. But one night when mostly everyone had gone home, but not everyone because the place never truly closed and ran on skeleton staff at night with people dying 24/7, he was caught on camera by the security firm contracted to provide those services for the funeral care provider. Apparently they caught this elderly man taking a walk around the place before vanishing, and an alarm that shouldn't have been tripped was tripped. When the staff was sent and viewed the footage because the alarm was tripped, to their horror, it was confirmed that it was the dead elderly gentleman that had been brought in previously. He was still in the refrigerated unit. To this day, they have no explanation for it. Additionally, he told me it wasn't uncommon for the alarms to be tripped at the funeral homes at night as if someone was walking around them, which once again meant the contracted security firm had to get in touch with someone at the company during the night so they could send someone over there to turn it off. They would go over there to turn the alarm off, and nobody would be there. Pretty crazy stuff. There's a lot of creepy stuff that happens in our field. During COVID, our local hospital stored all their COVID tests in the morgue cooler next to all the bodies. Half the hospital staff came down with severe sinus infections but couldn't figure out why. I have a lot of stories about the dead, but the creepiest involve the living. In our local hospital, when you walk into the morgue room, it's a big room with an autopsy table, then you walk through a small hall, and then there's an entrance into the morgue cooler. I was bringing someone in who needed an autopsy done. Because of how often I'm in and out, the hospital gave me a key so I can let myself in so I'm not tying up security to bring me down. Anyway, I bring this person in and bring them to the morgue. Get in there, all the lights are off, so I assume I'm alone. I fill out the paperwork, then head to the cooler to get a table. Now, when you walk into a morgue cooler and you think you're alone, you're not mentally thinking about anyone being alive in the cooler. Well, I opened the door of the cooler, and lo and behold, there was a security guard and housekeeper going at it. Scared the absolute shit out of me. Of all the places in the hospital, I would have never, in a million years, been prepared to see what I saw. I slowly closed the door, left the body on the autopsy table, and left. I went back 3 days later, and both the guard and the housekeeper resigned. I worked in the ICU, and my patient had leukemia and lost pretty much her entire clotting system. Every place we had stuck a needle or pierced her anywhere for about the last week or so started bleeding and looked like thin ketchup. She had had chest tube punctures, multiple 4 starts, and every finger had multiple blood sugar sticks, all of which were leaking red. She was only 19, so we were trying really hard to save her. Trying to pump donor blood into her veins using pressure bags. Frantically, we worked following the instructions of the leader of the code and moving so fast doing CPR and giving drugs that blood was getting flung all over because you couldn't touch her anywhere without getting blood all over your gloves. In the end, she didn't make it, of course. The one little ICU room looked like a slaughterhouse, with blood everywhere, floor, curtains, room divider curtains, ceiling, monitoring equipment, and everyone that worked on her. I was a student nurse at the time and was working with the patient's nurse. I had to keep going out to get various things to help, and I kept passing by her newly married husband sitting on a stretcher all alone in the hall, waiting for news. I've never seen such a mess of blood in a single room since then. I held a blood clot in my hand that killed a person. Maybe not creepy, but being in a medical examiner's office was definitely eye-opening. Two things that stuck out were watching an autopsy on a fat woman in her 40s, like 300 to 350 pounds. First, her skull was really thick, and it took extra passes with the saw to finally get through. Even the guy doing the sawing said something about it being one of the thickest he's seen. Oh, and the way they cut the face off and peeled it down to the neck was trippy. They cut her open, weighed all the organs, and finally got to the heart. It was a big one, again, according to the me guy, and he found the cause of death, a blood clot. He put it in my hand, and it was like the size of a ball in a ballpoint pen. Amazingly, something so small can kill you. Then they brought out the body of a young 20-year-old guy who had been sitting outside for a few days. Half his body was green and bloated, and I simply cannot put into words how bad it smelled, but when the swamps of Dagoba story is mentioned, that's the smell I think of. The guy was likely a drug overdose, as there were no outward signs of injury. The smell was horrible, but the last thing I saw before I had to leave was them ramming a swab, long Q-tip, basically the swabs used to test for COVID in the early part, up the urethra. I know he's dead, but I still cringe thinking of that. I worked for a pathologist in college. I've packaged every single part of a human body for shipment via FedEx. Human brain, head, nipple, prostate, wacky tumors, try me, I've done it all. I have seen insane things go wrong in the lab. Someone lost legs, torsos, etc. for days at a time. The smell would eventually give up its location. The logistics of it require tight operations, and unfortunately they don't have the staff to run it that way, so shit happens. Process breaks down. Autopsies. There are lots of autopsies. I got pretty immune to it all, but the stillborn fetuses and very young left a mark emotionally, I can't lie. Having just watched the Dahmer shows, he liked it all, and it kind of makes me sick, especially having a real tangible point of view on what he was handling and apparently being aroused by. It's so bizarre. I'm much older now and solid on the behavioral health aspect. I'm just reflecting on it here. I've also seen and worked in every part of a hospital. From OR, ER, ICU, NICU, post-op, etc., all of it. Weird SHT happens everywhere. These can be chaotic environments. Also, yes, these were my college years, and coworkers were having sex all over the place. Hospital basements, etc. It's not all the drama of Grey's Anatomy, but the hospital-based soap opera shows are based on some truth. Scrubs were closer. In my experience, my hospital was in a small town with a huge university a mile away, so the demographics meshed well. I grew up in a nursing home. I saw my first body when I was 4 and grew up always surrounded by sickness and death, but also a lot of wisdom, as the elderly had much to say, especially to a small child. I grew used to seeing dead bodies and losing friends constantly, so in general, I don't get shaken by much. I was a big kid, so starting at around age 9, they would enlist my help to carry the bodies up or down the stairs. I didn't have any issues with this except one time when I was probably 13 or 14. She was an elderly woman of roughly 70 or 80, and she had almost every cancer you can get. She couldn't and wouldn't eat or drink anything, and she was completely unconscious her whole time there. We were just waiting for her to die soon, but she survived for over 2 weeks with no food or fluids, only from a drip. I remember going up there and seeing her face, and it stuck with me all these years because of how completely inhuman she seemed. Her face was so gaunt and sunken that it looked avian in nature. Her skin clung to her bones and had turned a dark gray color, and you could see every single bone in her body due to how tight her skin was sucked to it. She had no fat or muscle whatsoever, and when we picked her up, she couldn't have weighed more than 50 pounds. She seemed as light as a feather and as though one wrong move and she'd turn to dust. I nicknamed her the Bird Lady, and she's been stuck in my mind for almost 10 years now. Here we go. Back in the day, I used to work for a funeral home, and oftentimes, when an elderly client had arrangements and passed away, I would be dispatched to collect their earthly remains and bring them back to the funeral home to be prepped for their celebration of life or going away party. This is after there is no suspected foul play. Sometimes this would be a collection directly from the morgue or from their residence. More often than not, this was typically in the middle of the night. On call 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Well, one night I was dispatched to collect an elderly gentleman who crossed the Rainbow Bridge and was deemed to be picked up around 1 a.m. By the time I got ready and got to the residence, it was around 2 a.m., and back to the funeral home around 3 a.m. Once I helped Mr. Doe get comfortable in our cooler, I was ready to leave. As I was just getting ready to set the alarm and head back home, the prep room door behind me flung open and then slammed very abruptly. This door is very big and heavy and takes some power to open and close. Needless to say, I was early for my normal shift in the morning because, well, I didn't go back to sleep. The creepiest thing about it is that just before that happened, the hair rose on the back of my neck. A friend told me this story ages ago, and I hope I remember it well enough. When he was 18, he worked for a single plane transport contractor, and one time they had to carry a body. It wasn't autopsied or prepared for the funeral yet, that was where they were taking it. So it was wrapped and just sort of laid on the floor. Now, when you're in the air, I'm sure other pilots will tell you that the rise and fall of the airplane will do strange things with gravity, air pressure, and necromancy. In any case, the corpse had enough air in its lungs that the lower pressure outside the body caused the air inside to be expelled slowly and through the larynx. Meanwhile, the rise and fall of the plane caused the body to sit up and the wrapping to fall away. Sitting up causes it to expel more air from the lungs. So while flying a dead body in the plane, they heard a long, low moan and saw a dead body sit up in the back of the plane. The pilot panicked, left the controls, and ran back and punched the corpse across the face, knocking it back down. He told me about how they figured out what happened, but I was laughing too hard at that point to really pick up the details. I do remember that they had to explain the additional damage to the corpse when they arrived at their destination. I spent 3 years working in an NYC ER. On the 4th of July one year, it was a pleasantly slow day, as holidays typically are. We had a red phone that EMS would call to let us know about a patient coming in, maybe a heart attack, a stroke, or someone actively getting CPR. Usually about 5 to 10 minutes out. This day, I picked up the phone, and dispatch said a gunshot victim was coming in. We are not a level I trauma hospital, so getting a gunshot victim is exceedingly rare. It means they're nearby and on the brink of death, so they can't afford the time to go to the trauma center. There is no ETA on this guy. Well, after I hung up, EMS was rolling in to do compressions. Very few people survive a cardiac arrest due to trauma. His odds were not in his favor, and after opening his chest up to plug the holes in the heart, we called it. He was gone. He didn't have any ID on him, so we had no way of even identifying him or contacting his family. It was the first time I'd ever been to an active crime scene. A homicide investigation began to unfold. It was surreal having to allow men in suits to take photos of my patient. I go on my lunch break and have my ceremonial McDonald's after a difficult case. I come back, and thankfully, the homicide is done with the ER, and he is in the morgue. A bit later, we found out the police figured out this guy's identity, which was a huge relief to us. Later on, my charge nurse informs me that homicide tried to go to our morgue, but there was no body. Truly, they searched everywhere. His body was gone. About 3 surreal hours later, we found out that there's a separate morgue for unidentified patients. They were looking in the wrong grave, and we didn't know it for 3 hours. But for those 3 Schrödinger cat hours, we had lost a homicide victim's body. I don't work in a morgue or with the dead, but I unexpectedly lost both my mom in 2020 and my closest sister in 2022. When my mom passed, my sister was the first to discover her. By the time I got to the house, EMTs had tried to revive her and failed, and she was still wearing a plastic mask of some kind on or in her mouth that some emergency tubing had been attached to. We called a priest for final rites, Catholic family, and my uncle and I had to pick her up from the floor to get her on her bed. We almost slipped, and I remember that her head kind of whipped back and her teeth made this awful, dull clacking sound against the plastic aperture of the mask. It simultaneously creeped me out and made me even sadder that she had to undergo such indignities in death. With my sister, I was the one to discover that she'd died in her sleep in the same house. I didn't have a key to the door, and I'm a big guy and couldn't get through her bedroom window. She wasn't responding to my yells, so I grabbed a brick from the little flower bed out front and dropped it through the window and onto her leg. It twitched a little bit, which gave me a moment's hope, but nothing else happened, and it was discovered when the EMTs got there that she'd been gone for hours. I can still see it in my mind's eye, that twitch.